Thank you for downloading this episode of the Physicians Gallery podcast. In this series, we explore the history of medicine from A to Z, taking you on a journey from autopsies to zoonosis. Our wide range of topics includes diseases and treatments, plants and chemicals, and myths and curiosities. Please support us and help us to reach new audiences by liking, following, or leaving a comment on whatever podcast platform you are listening on. We hope you enjoy the podcast. Welcome to the Physicians Gallery podcast as we explore the history of medicine from A to Z. My name is Daisy Cunynghame and I am the Physicians Gallery's Heritage Manager.
My name's Olivia Howarth and I'm a volunteer with the Physicians Gallery.
My name is Laura Burgess. I'm also a volunteer with the Physicians Gallery.
And today we've made it as far as P. So Laura, what is your P word?
My P word is pregnancy. Pregnancy is such a big topic, so I decided to pinpoint a specific element of pregnancy, and I went for pregnancy tests. And what I found was very disturbing, but also very interesting. So pregnancy tests, kind of what we see them as today, are, the white sticks. You pee on one end, wait for 3 minutes, and you get your confirmation of whether or not you're pregnant. But obviously, they haven't always been around. So the earliest written records of a urine-based pregnancy test can be found in ancient Egypt. A papyrus described a test in which a woman who might be pregnant would collect wheat and barley and then would pee on it over several days. And then if the barley grows, it means there's a male child. If the wheat grows, it means there's a female child. And if neither of them grow, she is not pregnant at all. So these are kind of the earliest examples of, I guess, medical understanding that women's pee when pregnant is slightly different to other people's pee, which obviously will progress on. And then I found another interesting part of pregnancy, which is kind of more fertility testing as well as checking to see if you're pregnant. And I hope this is not true. So I'm going to go in here with a pinch of salt. In which, in ancient Egypt, a woman would insert a head of garlic into her vagina, leave it for the night, and if the next morning, if she smelled garlic through her mouth, then she's not pregnant. But if she doesn't, then she could be pregnant, because there's this idea that the smell is blocked by something in the uterus. Whether or not that is genuine, I don't know, but I've really felt the need to put it in here because I found some examples of it online, and I really hope it isn't true.
Is that the idea? So the smell of the garlic would travel up internally and come out of your mouth, and that would be what would indicate that you're not pregnant?
Yeah, so the idea is that if you can smell it, it means it's made its way up and there's no blockage. But if you don't smell it, that would then mean that you are, because you'd then infer that there is something blocking that smell coming through your body.
What if you're just constipated or something, or you had a kidney stone? I don't know. Is there?
Maybe then you could be like, let me pee on some wheat or some barley and see how we get on. So apparently back in the 1960s, they actually tested the theory of the barley and wheat testing from ancient Egypt. And it was actually found that 70% of the time, the urine of pregnant women did promote growth, while urine of non-pregnant women and men did not. So we get to the Middle Ages and the 17th century. And they stick with pee. So I kind of actually for this podcast could have talked about pee rather than pregnancy, but I'm going to combine them. And they kind of focused on pee to detect pregnancy by looking at the visual, the smells, and the scent of pee. And these things, I'm not sure if anyone heard of, called piss prophets.
Yes. We've talked about these guys, slightly odd habit on, I think it was the episode about the bladder, but please go on. I want to hear what they say about pregnancy.
Well, I think for me, I put this in here because I love the idea that in history there are these group of men calling themselves piss prophets because they think that they can use urine to kind of predict a multitude of things. There's like a medieval urine wheel. I think there's an example of it in the Wellcome Library, where it kind of indicates that you can diagnose a disease by different colour, smell and taste.
We have a book in our library called Judicium Uranium, which is the judgment of urine, which is a similar sort of thing with lots of different colours of urine jars. And whenever I get it out at an event where there are physicians there, they get so excited. I had the chief medical officers, including Chris Whitty, at an event recently, and they were all trying to diagnose all the different colours. So physicians were like, ooh, purple, now that could mean, and then they go on a whole tangent, very excitedly diagnose it.
We're now moving on to the 1920s, where in Germany, and this is where I'm going to butcher some names, Thelma Aschheim and Bernard Zondek described a test known as the A to Z test, or the Aschheim-Zondek test, which identified the presence of HCG in urine. So, to test for pregnancy, a woman's urine would be injected into an immature rat or mouse. And then if the subject was not pregnant, there would be no reaction to this injection of urine. In the case of pregnancy, the rat or mouse would show a reaction, basically being in heat despite its immaturity. Unfortunately, the way that they would find this is they would then kill the animal and dissect to see if its ovaries had enlarged. So this was kind of the first example of testing that actually was then developed even further to the use of frogs. So the Hogburn test is again a very similar thing where you're trying to identify the hormone in women's pee. It's named after the British zoologist Lancelot Hodgson, who developed it in the 1930s, and it basically involved injecting pee into a female frog, usually an African clawed frog. If HCG is present in the urine, the frog will ovulate and produce eggs within hours. So this method didn't require death of any frogs, thank God. And this was used in the 1930s. And then it's up until the 1960s, in which we then see the development of the strip and the pee testing. And that's kind of all I got to, because I got so fascinated by the introduction of rats and mice and frogs to figuring out if women were pregnant. But it was just crazy that was kind of, you look back and you think that's some sort of modernity there. And they were literally relying on poor frogs and injecting women's wee. Ick. Sorry, that's just awful. I just said ick on a podcast, but it's very gross. But very interesting to see that from ancient Egypt, there was this kind of beginning of an idea that you can use urine of pregnant women to identify that they're pregnant, or that there is an element of something in that urine that has then been researched and looked into for centuries.
It's interesting, given that bloodletting was such a strong treatment for such a long time, that it's urine that's the diagnostic in the case of pregnancy and not blood. Less invasive?
We should just be grateful that it's not fecal matter, I think.
Oh,
Oh, well, when you were talking about having a diagram of the colours of urine, I was thinking, I'm sure I've seen diagrams of different types of fecal matter that people put on display in their toilets. So maybe there should be a trend towards urine.
we should bring back piss profits. That's what we should bring back.
It's
That's
a
what we
good
need.
punk band, isn't it? It feels like the name of a punk band.
It's just wild to me, but so fascinating that something you can buy now at the corner shop used to be frogs.
I think that's a good line to end on. That sounds like
That's how I swear it away, yeah.
So my P is Pepys, as in Samuel Pepys. Samuel Pepys was a 17th century civil servant. He was briefly a member of parliament, and he was for a much longer time an administrator for the Royal Navy. And the reason that Samuel Pepys is remembered primarily is because for a 9-year period, he kept a diary. And those 9 years were very eventful. So they covered the Great Fire of London and the Great Plague, amongst other things. And Pepys' diary is fascinating to historians because it covers so many things. So it covers these major events, it covers fashion, it covers food, it covers sickness and medicine. And it is a very unusually detailed description. So other people who were keeping diaries would typically write, went to a party, went to Parliament, but he described what people were wearing, what people were talking about, what people were doing in incredible detail, which means it's a really, really useful source. The downside to all of that is that I would argue Pepys can be a bit overused, and he was a very upper middle class, wealthy, elite person. So it can end up giving the impression when you read a lot of these histories that his life was a typical life of a person in the 17th century, and it really, really wasn't. Just to give you an example, if you think Pepys was in any way a normal person, at one point he had a pet lion. So this is not an average person's life. If you've got a pet lion, you're probably not a normal average person. So the reason I'm bringing up Pepys, though, is he talks a lot about his health and his family's health. Just a couple of examples in his diaries, he talks about his colds, his trapped wind, bruises and falls, diarrhea, melancholy, sadness, depression, hangovers, constipation, ulcers, boils, different kinds of wounds and cuts. So there's a lot of description of what happens, but also how these things are treated. He wrote quite a bit about his wife's menstrual cycle and their attempts to conceive a child. And that's the sort of thing that's often missing from the historical record, that very personal description of menstrual cycles and how things like that worked at that time. He talks about problems with his eyesight and how he tried to treat those problems with eye drops and special green-tinted spectacles. One of my favourites is he describes how when he was staying away from home, and this is a quote, "I to bed, and in the night was mightily troubled with a looseness, I suppose from some fresh damp linen that I put on this night. And feeling for a chamber pot, there was none. So I was forced in this strange house to rise and shit in the chimney." Not everyone tells you these stories, so this is what makes Pepys special. And there's a couple of medical topics that he goes into a lot of detail with. One of them is the fact that he had problems with bladder and kidney stones from a young age. So this is a recurring problem throughout his life. And when he was 25, it got so bad that he decided to be operated on. And of course, in the 17th century, there's a huge amount of risk attached to this. And he knew that. So it shows how bad the pain was that he decided he was going to do this. There was no pain relief, no antiseptic, of course. And he was cut from his scrotum to his anus in order to have them removed. And he was very aware of how incredibly lucky he was that he survived this. It was a long recovery, and he continued to be in a lot of pain for a long time, but he was really aware that it was quite unusual. And so he had a party every year. He had an anniversary party on the day of the operation to celebrate the fact that he had survived the operation. The other medical thing which he talked about in great detail was, of course, the Great Plague. He was living in London, so he was in the heart of what was happening when the plague broke out. And he talks about, in a way that feels very reminiscent to us now that we've all lived through a pandemic, he talked about how strange it was to walk the streets of London, to see the streets empty, to see the shops closed up for the first time he ever experienced, that everything being shuttered. He wrote about things that he was doing to protect himself. So he was chewing tobacco because it was seen as a preventative. He talked about the horror when he first saw the red crosses, which were painted on the doors of those who were infected. But also he talked about the boring stuff, the weird little minutiae of it. So he talked about how there was a great risk in buying a new wig, because what if that wig was made from the hair of somebody who had died from the plague? And, so it was an infected or diseased wig. On a non-medical note, he was really at the heart of everything. So I was looking at what were the firsts that he mentioned. So Pepys was apparently present at the first ever Punch and Judy puppet show. That was in Covent Garden. He was the first person to inform the king that the Great Fire of London, that the fire had broken out. He is apparently the first person to write in English about having read pornography. He bought what he called a mighty lewd book. He read it cover to cover, but he was so appalled that he burnt it afterwards. But he wasn't so appalled that he didn't read it. So, make of that what you will. But just to finish up, if anyone is interested in delving more into Samuel Pepys and reading his diary, they were first published in 1825, but I would highly recommend reading a version published after the 1970s, because the earlier version is heavily censored. So things relating to sex, to menstruation, all that sort of stuff, it was removed from earlier versions.
I like the idea of Samuel Pepys being the equivalent of a daily blogger. Like, he quite literally is sharing the most.
A chronic oversharer, I think. I wonder what Mrs. Pepys thinks about intimate details about her menstruation being out there in the world.
Well, the thing is, it's difficult to tell exactly what Pepys wanted to happen to his diaries, because on the one hand, he kept them, but he didn't obviously publish them in his lifetime. And some of it was even written in code. It was a mix of different languages. Some of it was in Latin and some of it was in code. So he obviously didn't want anyone to just pick them up and read them. It was written in a way that wasn't possible. But at the same time, he didn't destroy them. So in my head, he wanted people to read it after he was dead, but he didn't want people to read it in his lifetime, is my sort of reckoning of it. And I guess he thought, she'll be fine with it because,
We'll both be dead, so...
Yeah, exactly. But he was somewhat careful, at least, that it wouldn't be decipherable to just anybody who happened to find it sort of lying around.
Do we know what parts of it were in code? Do we know if there was specific parts that he was like, I'm going to write about this, but I want to make sure no one knows? For someone who is such a clear oversharer and someone who is very much wanting to write down everything that happened, I'd be interested to see what he would consider what needs to be put in code but still written down versus what could just be openly written about.
I think menstruation was one of those things, but I don't know, as you say, exactly where the line was in his mind. He seemed quite fine with bodily functions. I don't think, he seemed quite comfortable with the idea of describing in detail when he had diarrhea or when he, took a shit in a fireplace.
That feels reminiscent of a man talking about the morning after a big night, where he wakes up and he realises his shit in the chimney. It's just so funny because you can't imagine it of a very, someone who's very upper class to do something so gross.
I'm just thinking, I've got a pub quiz fact about Samuel Pepys, was that when the fire broke out, he buried his cheese in the garden because it was so valuable and he didn't want it to be destroyed.
Well, it's also I was going to say the duality of that. That's not the right word. That's too pretentious. But before that happened, he had actually sent a lot of his belongings out of London, and his wife left as well. So he stayed behind, but his sort of key things were sent out of the city altogether. But he wanted to keep his cheese nearby. So it's that combination of it was important enough to be buried, but he didn't want. He's just like, but I need my cheese, right? Just on a day-to-day basis, I need my cheese.
I mean, it's quite a clever way of storing it because it can be nice and cool, even in the ground. He's essentially just creating a storage space, but in the ground. That's fascinating. I'm assuming he didn't dig the hole himself.
I imagine he will have had someone to dig it for him. That's my assumption, but yes.
I really hope a neighbour was just like, Samuel, what are you doing? He's like, I'm just burying my cheese, don't worry about it.
So what's your P then, Olivia?
So I've gone for phrenology. I'll start with a quick overview. Phrenology is a pseudoscience that involved the study of the shape of the human skull to determine a person's personality, intellect, and potential abilities. It's based on the idea that the brain is composed of several organs, each responsible for a different aspect of the mind, and that the size of the organs could be determined by feeling the skull. It claimed to be scientific, but was widely discredited within decades of its emergence. It emerged as an analytical science in the 18th century. Its origins are most closely associated with the German physician Franz Joseph Gall, who believed that our intelligence, our moral character, and our personality traits are innate. He thought that the skull shape reflected the development of 27 different brain organs, and that it was possible to determine character traits, which he called faculties, by examining the shape of a person's skull. For example, this might indicate if someone had good math skills or criminal tendencies. It might tell you about their perception of time or their need to be praised. Gall's theory was taken up by his assistant and collaborator, the physician Johann Spurzheim, who coined and popularized the term phrenology. As was the case with other early phrenologists, Spurzheim believed that phrenology could be used in social reform efforts. In 1815, the Edinburgh Review published an article by the anatomist John Gordon, who called phrenology a mixture of gross errors and extravagant absurdities. Gordon was well respected in the Edinburgh medical community, and so it wasn't a small task for Spurzheim to try and convince a potentially very sceptical audience of phrenology's worth. In a letter to his friend, Madame Pothier, he wrote, "I wish to know Edinburgh, its professors, and whole scientific trade, and the character of the Scotch nation, because they have the reputation as the first in the United Kingdoms of Great Britain. And I must meet my adversaries personally. I must see their cerebral organisation. A friend of mine is now in Edinburgh. He thinks that many professors are very anxious to attend my lectures." And it was one of these lectures which was attended by the lawyer George Combe. In 1820, George and his physician brother, Andrew Combe, formed the Edinburgh Phrenological Society, the first of its kind, and published the first phrenological periodicals, the Phrenological Journal and Phrenological Transactions. George Combe is often acknowledged as introducing phrenology to Britain through the publication of his work, The Constitution of Man, Considered in Relation to External Objects, first published in 1826. By 1860, it had sold 100,000 copies in Britain and twice that number in America, and by the end of the 19th century, it had even outsold Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species. Despite initially framing itself as a means of understanding human psychology, phrenology was increasingly applied as a theory of racial categorization and hierarchization, used to justify the poor treatment of criminals and people with mental health problems, support racist beliefs and practices, and implicitly justify white imperialism and colonialism. Phrenology was never universally accepted and was eventually abandoned. So that's my little summary overview. Quite intense. I'm a great Bronte fan, and unfortunately, Charlotte Bronte in particular was quite heavily influenced by the kind of cultural aspects of phrenology and physiognomy. In Jane Eyre, Charlotte uses language of phrenology in reference to organs of benevolence, veneration, and adhesiveness. Rochester has a solid mass of intellectual organs, but a lack of benevolence. And St. John has a high forehead. In Villette, the main character, Lucy Snow, she actually examines the skull of Dr. John, which leads her to believe the sympathetic faculty was not prominent in him. So he didn't possess the same perception that she had, and it forces her to admit that they aren't compatible.
I love the idea of just using touching the skull to be like, I don't think we should date.
Yeah.
I'm also a big Jane Eyre fan. I do enjoy, now that people are looking back, like looking at it and being like, she really is just describing Rochester as the ugliest guy with like the worst personality, and yet we need to root for them.
He's a really good anti-hero.
Yes.
You love to hate him, but also love him. But then other people, like Dickens, used humour and sarcasm to criticise phrenologists who promoted their trade for personal gain. In David Copperfield, he describes a pie with a disappointing crust that was full of lumps and bumps with nothing particular underneath. And then obviously there's the American popularity of phrenology that was spurred on by Fowler and Wells Company, which created quite a lot of merchandise with the slogan, "Know thyself." So that's where you get quite a lot of the phrenological head models from.
I wonder if it was, like you said, ever considered really a really strict science, because I feel like they developed it and they were like, let's use this as entertainment. Because I feel, wasn't there like salons where people could go and get their heads checked and then that could decipher their personality?
There was definitely some articles that I looked at that suggested that young people at the time were really caught up with the idea that phrenology was this emerging science, and it was the elder, more established medical people who were like, what on earth are you talking about? This is utter nonsense. And that maybe that contributed to it declining so quickly after it emerged. You're right, yeah, definitely went into more the route of spiritualism and mesmerism and became a bit more of an entertainment factor.
The 19th century in particular is when a lot of branches of medicine become much more scientific. You know, you've got your first vaccine, you've got laboratory science, you've got increasing understanding of disease and treatment. And then anything to do with the brain and mental health and all that sort of stuff is sort of still doesn't have a robust science behind it. It's still a bit muddled. And what they're trying to do, perhaps, is trying to prove that this branch of medicine has a science to it in the way that respiratory medicine or cardiology has a science to it. And so there's a lot of different things to do with the brain and mental health, which are sort of, it's like throwing stuff at a wall. To see what sticks. You know, they go through a lot of cycles of trying different things, and this is one of those things which, it's trying to create a logic, because anything to do with the brain seems so much more unknowable than something to do with the heart or the bladder or something.
It was like a kind of metric that they could use, like, you're, not good at maths because that part of your brain isn't as developed. I can feel it. You need to be exercising that organ a bit more. It's not rigorously scientific in the way that we would understand now.
So it's interesting that even during a time where they're all trying to medicalize and specialize in these things and prove that they should be, existing within the sphere of medicine, that they can't just accept that there are emotions and kind of things to the brain that maybe cannot be proven.
They definitely were criticised because they couldn't reproduce the same results.
I would love to know how they allocated it, because I know that there's things like marriage or likes kids or things like that. I'm like, how do you allocate that to a certain part of the brain? Like, who sat down and was like, so if you've got a bit of a lump on the back of your head, it means you're going to hate your husband.
There's that idea that there is a ideal shape as well.
Of course there is like an ideal. But how do you change it? It's just another indicator of showing how medicine wants you to hate yourself sometimes.
I think we should probably end at the point where medicine wants us to hate ourselves.
Thank you for listening to this Physicians Gallery podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, click like, or leave a positive review or comment. We truly appreciate your support because it helps us reach more people. If you'd like to know more about the Physicians Gallery, our exhibitions and upcoming events, please check out our website and social media pages. Links are in the description for this episode. Thank you.